Hi, my name is Elias Muhanna. I'm the author of the Qifa blog on Lebanese political affairs and a PhD candidate at Harvard University and a visiting fellow at Stanford Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law.
And I am Camille Otrakji, one of the authors and moderators in Syria Comment, and the founder of a number of Syrian blogs and sites.
So we're going to be speaking today about the situation in Syria, and probably maybe begin first with the just a brief discussion about President Obama's speech on Thursday afternoon at the State Department. This was the second major address by President Obama on the situation in the Middle East. The first obviously was in the summer of 2009 in Cairo, and this one comes on the heels of several months of major uprisings across the region. Camille, what is your sense? I thought the speech disappointed in certain ways. He didn't seem to really say anything. I think they had built up the speech as if there was going to be some major new American initiative, a major change in American policy towards the Middle East. And I think, there was some very nice rhetoric, but at the end of the day, there wasn't really much of a bold new direction or a bold new vision. What was your sense?
Well, you probably know that nobody liked the speech in the Middle East. In Israel, they hated it. One of the members of Knesset called President Obama the new Arafat. It doesn't get worse than that. In the Arab world, they were very disappointed for a number of reasons. They thought maybe now that they have started movements toward democracy in a number of countries, that the last excuse that Washington has for not being biased towards Israel in the Middle East would be gone. But they heard the president again put a lot of emphasis on U.S. relations with Israel, shared values with Israel, but not with the Arab world. He mentioned we have the same shared values when he talked about Israel. He doesn't say that when he talks about the Arab countries. Emphasis on the commitment to the security of Israel. And the Arabs, of course, feel that Israel does not need more emphasis on its security because it is much more powerful than the Arabs.
There was some criticism. That what they're suggesting is revolutionary or groundbreaking about the speech is that he actually committed the U.S. to the 1967 borders, which is apparently something that is new for a U.S. administration.
Well, I'm not sure if it's new because in the past, for example, many administrations have committed to UN resolutions. UN Resolution 242, 338, and I think 497 for the Golan Heights. And these UN resolutions say the same thing, that the solution will be based on the 67 borders. He just used the 67 borders, those words specifically, but he failed to mention UN resolutions. And this is something that worries me, that the United States have forgotten about all those UN resolutions. And we seem to get the feeling that the international system that governs our planet is not what it used to be. Nobody talks about the UN anymore except when they want to come up with a new resolution that they would like to use for military action somewhere. But we've had since the 60s and 70s and 80s so many UN resolutions on the Middle East that the United States and Israel do not want to talk about anymore. And Arabs do not like that because it worries them. We don't know if Sarah Palin becomes the next US president, for example, and she decides that whatever the United States finds to be compatible with American values or interests, that should take place in the Middle East and the whole world will follow. It's dangerous.
Okay, well, let me ask you about the portion of the speech that was devoted to Syria. This came a day after the U.S. imposed sanctions on key members of the Syrian government, including the president. And President Obama, had some strong words for the Syrian government. He didn't go so far as to demand that Bashar al-Assad step down, but he did say that he needs to lead a transition to political reform, or he needs to get out of the way?
Towards
what did you make of that?
I think he said towards diplomacy, towards democracy.
Towards democracy, yeah. Which signals that the U.S. position on Syria remains that they want to see Bashar al-Assad in charge. They want to see democracy, or they want to see a move towards that, but they don't want to see, perhaps reading between the lines, they don't want to see somebody other than Bashar al-Assad leading it right now. What's your sense?
Well, my sense is that when we say the U.S., it's a mistake, because in the U.S. you have different currents, and Washington D.C. is divided when it comes to Syria. It's always been divided. You have the right-wing think tanks, journalists, senators, who always hated Syria's position in the Middle East since the 70s, since Syria expressed its lack of support to the Camp David Accords when President Carter convinced Egypt's Anwar Sadat to sign a separate peace treaty with Israel. That left Syria, of course, alone with little hope of recovering its Golan Heights that Israel occupied in '67. And since that point, the U.S. and Syria split. Before that, President Nixon and Henry Kissinger were visiting Damascus, and they were actually good friends with Hafez al-Assad. They were always, in meetings they were joking and having fun. And since '77, there was that split with Damascus. And since then, we have in Washington, D.C., people like Dennis Ross, Elliot Abrams, who have been the anti-Syria lobby. No matter what you want to discuss in Washington, if it involves Syria, they will lobby against Syria. They will lobby for the strongest position to be taken.
So you think that the current, that Obama is basically pandering to the anti-Syria crowd? You don't sense anything different, basically, in Obama's approach to Syria?
No, I do actually. He's not bad. I like President Obama. I understand the limitations he has. By the way, President Bashar al-Assad has limitations also with hardliners in Damascus. And people expect both of them to deliver because, for some reason, people had expectations when President Bashar al-Assad took power and when President Obama took power. President Obama said, yes, we can, before he took power. And 2 years later on Jon Stewart's show, he was asked, do you still believe, yes, we can? And he says, yes, we can, but not overnight. And President Bashar al-Assad is faced with the same situation where he has to reform Syria, and he realized that it's not that easy. President Obama President Obama also came.
Right, but Obama has a Congress and that is hamstringing him, whereas Bashar doesn't have the same kinds of obstacles. Or are you saying that he has significant obstacles in his way? I mean, he's the president, he's the face of Syria, but to what extent is he constrained by those around him?
Well, you have the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party, according to Article number 8, I think, is the Syrian Constitution, is the leading party of the country and of society. Yes, he has to answer a bit to the Ba'ath Party. And he has the security services and the army. And he is strong also, the president. Increasingly, he's becoming stronger the past few years. But the first few years when people expected him in year 2000, for example, to deliver reforms, no, he was still a 34-year-old who had to respect everybody's different views. I think it was very naive to expect him in year 2000 to deliver sweeping reforms. But the past few years, he did gain the upper hand, if you want, in many aspects. And now he can reform much more, especially after the popular pressure. People in the Ba'ath who were resisting reforms, or even in security services, they had to already give up on their previous concerns.
Let's talk then about the situation then in Syria and the demands for reform. Today was labeled Freedom Friday in Syria. These protests have really coalesced on Fridays when people go to congregational prayer. And today we see about something like 20 or 30. It's very hard to get good information out of Syria.
Between 20 to 30, apparently, yeah.
Yeah, killed in Homs, which is a major city.
Not only in Homs, I think it's all over Syria, probably, yeah. But
including neighborhoods of Damascus.
Not in Damascus. When they say Damascus, it's probably in the in the neighborhoods around Damascus, which
yeah,
are poorer and more conservative than Damascus.
Right.
Yes.
So again, significant violence today with police using water cannons and tear gas, and Al Jazeera is reporting machine guns. So anyway, and also some younger people, like children killed. What is your sense of the situation? Do you think that this is going to escalate? Do you think that where do you see it going from here? You keep pretty close tabs. You have people that you speak to in Damascus and all over Syria. What's your sense of the situation?
It changes on a daily basis. Yesterday, for example, before the protest of this Friday, I was feeling more confident that we are over the violent phase of the protest movements, and now we'll head more towards only the peaceful protest and the reforms which the regime has been working on for the past few months, especially the past 2 months.
But were the protests today violent? Do we know that they were violent? I mean, the kids who were killed today, these 11-year-old and 16-year-old kids, they weren't carrying any weapons.
Well, when I say violent, okay, we'll get to the makeup of the protesters. If you want, I'll talk about that a bit after. But the point I was trying to make is that 2 days ago, the organizers of the protests movement on the Facebook page, the main Facebook page, the Syrian Revolution 2011, they called for general strike across Syria, and they were really expecting that the whole country would shut down to express its genuine support for the revolution against President Bashar al-Assad. Nothing of that happened. I think just some neighborhoods in Homs closed down. But the rest of the country, nothing happened. Everybody was going out to work, to restaurants, to school. So that tells you something.
I mean, the government
also... Pardon me?
The government also announced that anybody who didn't show up to work on those days would be dismissed from their jobs. So people probably, maybe there were people who would have gone, who would have engaged in the strike, but they were afraid of their.
Oh, I'm sure some people would like to support the protesters. I would be making the point that the number of those who protested until now does not reach 1% of the Syrian population, even though many people don't like me to say that, but it is the truth. They do not. 1% of the Syrian population would be about 200,000 people. And
you're saying that people who support, or people who have
who engage in protests, yeah, but there are many more who support them. And I agree with what you said, that if they were not scared to lose their job, for example, they would go out and participate in a demonstration, because one, they support it, and two, it's almost fun on a Friday, which is a weekend in Syria, to go and express your point of view, all the things you hate about the government, and there are many things to hate. So yes, absolutely, if they were not scared to lose their job, many would have participated in the call for a general strike or for demonstrations on Friday. But the fact they don't want even to lose their job, it shows you that they're not that angry at the government. Of course, anywhere you go, I mean, President Bush in the U.S., his popularity was hovering around 28%, I think, for a long time. So 3 out of 4 Americans did not like him. The same could be right in any country. So when I say 1% only demonstrated, it doesn't mean that support for the government is 99%, far from it. I'm sure most of the Syrian people hate so many things in the current regime and the way it has been running the country, but not to the extent of going out and losing their job even, or risking. We don't have the situation like we have in Libya, where they are willing to take Gaddafi's Air Force hitting them, and they just want to get rid of them.
But I mean, the situation in Egypt, you could argue the situation in Egypt was much less dire than it is in Syria. There was much more freedom of expression, there was civil society, the economic conditions were better, there was more stability, there wasn't as much, probably, the security services were not quite as heavy-handed as the Syrian mukhabarat, there wasn't the same kind of culture of
Right.
let's not criticize anybody, let's not criticize the government. People regularly criticize Mubarak. And yet, eventually, it snowballed to the point where you had hundreds of thousands in the street. Do you see that is a possibility in Syria, or
not yet?
What's your
a possibility? Yes, as in a 5-10% possibility. Yes, if the security forces continue to make mistakes, and they are continuing to make mistakes, they're using excessive force in dealing with some of the demonstrators. Yeah, it might one day, but for now, the Syrian people are just very tense about what's going on. I'll have to answer first the point you raised about Egypt. Again,
well, before we get to Egypt, let me just
the differences between Syria and Egypt, because you asked me why wouldn't we have the same thing happening in Syria? Hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, let's deal with that. I just want to pick up on something you said about the support, because we're still talking about support. We did an interview, you and I, on my blog, Nabki.com, a couple of weeks ago, where we were discussing the state of the protests in Syria. It was an interview that created a big discussion on the blog, about 700 odd comments.
725.
725 comments. And you argued, at that point, you were saying this similar thing. You said that only 1% of the country had joined the protests, while you believed that 80% of Syrians supported leaving the regime in place as long as it carried out reform. Do you still believe that the regime enjoys that support? Or has it come down in the last 2 weeks in your sense?
Maybe it came down a bit, but if it's not 80, it's 70% now. I mean, people who think of a bell curve. On one side, you have, actually, I'll quote Martin Fletcher, Times reporter, who managed to sneak inside Syria despite the ban on foreign reporters. He spent 6 days in Syria, including a day in Homs, and he's been arrested for 6 hours when the regime found out he's a reporter. When he came back, he did an interview with NPR in the US, and he said that he was really surprised when he went inside Syria that it's not what we're hearing outside. He said that the regime enjoys the support of 25% of the Syrian people, the full support, or he said something like they love the regime, 25% of Syrians. And well, he did not say, but there's minorities fall into that. And he said 15% hate the regime, absolutely hate the regime, and the rest of the Syrian people are in the middle. They are the people I'm saying who want serious reforms. They do not hate the regime. They do not love the regime. They just want to reform the country. They want the protests to finish. They want to go back to work, because Syria is a poor country. It cannot afford a protracted protest movement going on for month and month or years. Even Egypt, I read report that half the foreign reserves of the country is gone because of the few months that passed. And the country now is threatened with bankruptcy. So Syria most Syrians do not want to get there. They want the thing to be settled fast. Now, of course, we have 15%, or it's an estimate, Martin Fletcher's estimate, and close to my estimate, 15% who absolutely hate the regime. These are the people who continue to demonstrate now, and the people who support them also. I totally disagree with their approach. Yeah. I'm not in the 25% who love the regime, but I'm convinced that the only way for Syria, the only safe way, is to keep the regime, to keep central authority in power, and to expect serious reforms on all the corruption.
Okay, but let me ask you about that. I mean, if you are identifying yourself as a member of the 60 or 70 or whatever percent in the middle that wants to see major changes, but they also want to see the regime carry out those major changes.
Not necessarily because they love the regime, just because it's. I mean, maybe they like the regime, but it's because it's the safest way. And we've seen Egypt.
But what about this regime inspires confidence that they're going to do anything? I mean, Bashar al-Assad has been in power now for 11 years. The Ba'ath Party has been in power for over 40 years in Syria. What I mean, what do you say to somebody who is in that 15%, who hates this regime not on any sectarian basis, but because they have lost complete hope that there's anything, just structurally speaking, about this particular regime that is authoritarian, that is now shooting its people, that has lost legitimacy in their eyes, and doesn't have the ability to, even if Bashar al-Assad is a great guy, and as the West has tried to portray him in the past, the media has tried to portray him and his wife as being Western-oriented or, very well-educated, coming from the West. He listens to an iPod. He's computer savvy. He's trying to transform his country. He's part of the new generation. Even if he wanted to make major changes, people would argue that he's constrained by those exact same limits that you mentioned at the beginning of this discussion. So why should we imagine that even if we were to give him the benefit of the doubt, that they could do anything?
Well, first of all, I don't give him the benefit of the doubt all the way. He bears part of the blame because he is, like me, a risk-averse person, a bit excessively risk-averse. Things were working fine. He believed, and he might be right, that most Syrians were more interested in economic progress and economic reforms than political reforms. You might argue that he says that most Syrians he met and he talked to, people on the street, tell him, I need a higher salary, I don't have enough income to pay for my children's clothing and everything. So he concentrated on economic reforms, which are easier than political reforms. Political reforms will gain you enemies among the conservatives in the regime or in the security forces, and it will make his life more difficult. Of course, it's easier for him if he was ruling without having to answer to opposition in parliament or to a free press criticizing everything he does, fairly or not. So I blame him partially also for having preferred to keep political reforms for later in the future. Actually, in the Wall Street Journal interview, he said, that was about 4 months ago, before the protest movement reached Syria. He said that before you reform the whole structure, the people need to be re-educated, and that might take a generation. It was alarming to hear that, because I knew that we don't have time to wait for a generation. Even though I agree with what he said, because honestly, when I look at the Syrian opposition, they are a very disappointing bunch. I don't trust those people to be, again, I'm generalizing. No, I like many of them, but there are many in the Syrian opposition who are scary, frankly, scary the way they look. For example, the admin of the Facebook page, the Syrian Revolution 2011, and he says that there are a whole team. It's not only him who decides that. There's a whole team of people who admin that page. He has so many posts which are totally delusional. For example, they write things like, we know that 99.99% of the Syrian people are with us. Now, this is worse than the regime's 97% in those elections when the president wins 97% of the popular vote. These people are already claiming 99.99% popular support. So the president was right when he said that. He was right in saying there are things which take time before you are ready for reforms. But, well, too bad we don't have that luxury. There's a protest movement sweeping the Middle East, and people won't change faster. So, yeah, he made a mistake.
Surely one of the great virtues of democracy is that it enables you, in an ideal world, to filter out the nut jobs from the people who are qualified. I mean, we can't just sit around and wait for an opposition that comes out that is educated and that we all would vote for. I mean, we can't. At the end of the day, I mean, you have to kind of let the people make their choices, and maybe this guy, wouldn't be elected. Okay. And maybe he's just using the same kinds of rhetoric that the regime has used in the past.
Okay, but hold a second. We can't, I don't know what we can and what we cannot. We cannot risk going through to a civil war like Lebanon went through for decades. And we cannot end up like Iraq. In Iraq, over 1 million people died. In Lebanon, 250,000 people died. So if we are really sad that 700 or 800 people died so far, because the regime unleashed its security forces because it wants to stop the revolution from expanding. We have to also be worried about the possibility, think of it as 50% chance that 250,000 people would die, actually many more, because Lebanon is much smaller than Syria. 250,000 died in Lebanon. In Iraq, over 1 million people died. I am much more worried about that possibility. I know some people say, how, you're not enraged that 700 people died. Yes, I'm very uncomfortable every Friday, like today, 31 people died while protesting. Of course, I'm very unhappy, but I cannot lose track of the main danger, which is we have a 50-50 chance that we will end up in a civil war like Iraq and Lebanon.
But where are you getting that number, the 50-50 chance? I mean, this is just for the viewer, people who are watching this, who aren't necessarily following the story in Syria, this is a major point of contention between what the opposition is saying and what the regime is saying. Mm-hmm. The regime is constantly saying we want to prevent civil strife. If we go, then who knows? There could be civil war in Syria. There could be sectarian elements, radical fundamentalists who come to power. It could be like Iraq. It could be like Lebanon. The opposition is saying, no, we have a history of living together. Syrians have not butchered each other like they have in other places. And why can't there be a peaceful transition to more democratic system like we're seeing in Tunisia and in Egypt? Yes, Egypt has witnessed some violence over the past couple of weeks, but on the whole, there is a kind of, we don't see it. There's no civil war in Egypt. What is different about Syria?
Okay. First of all, I have no doubt that the vast majority of Syrians are able to live together, and they will not engage in hostilities in case we get into a chaotic situation, civil war-like situation. But you're Lebanese, Elias, and you know what it takes to start a civil war. You need 10% from this extreme and 10% from that extreme who are willing to carry arms and who already have arms, by the way, in Syria. And they will kill each other. Syria is a nation of 23 million people. 10% is over 2 million people. So if you have 2 million from here and 2 million from there fighting, that's civil war for you. Yes, 80% of Syrians are quite secular, and even if they're religious, they're open-minded and they're tolerant of minorities. Most of my friends are Sunni Muslims, and they're the most wonderful people. We have to distinguish between the majority in Syria, which is correctly, as the opposition claims, are secular and they're willing to live with each other, and between the very angry or very scared, armed two extremes of the two ends of the bell curve. Just because the opposition would. Sorry, I will interrupt.
Countries have that.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I just want to interrupt you. There's this. The opposition tries to say that Saif al-Islam in Libya warned of the same thing, so you cannot do the same in Syria. I don't care what Saif al-Islam said in Libya, and frankly, he's partially right, because we have tribal differences in Libya, and the nation is not united against Gaddafi. Probably 7 out of 10 are against him. But again, there are enough people with him, and his tribal differences there. In Syria, we have to compare with Egypt, yes, and with Tunisia. Egypt is 90% Sunni Muslim, 10% Christian. Syria, you have, I don't know how many religions and sects, many more. In Egypt...
But hold on, let's be clear about this. You say Egypt is 90% Sunni Muslim, 10% Christian. I mean, if you really want to do it in those terms, if you really want to break it down in terms of percentages, Syria is not that different. Yes, they have Alawis and they have other sects and they have Christians there, but Syria is 75% Sunni. Okay, I mean, it's not like Lebanon.
70 to 75. We don't know. 70 to 75. We don't know exactly. Okay, but go ahead. It's not like Lebanon. It's not like Egypt.
Okay, but it's not. It's closer. My point is, it's much closer to Egypt than it is to Lebanon. Lebanon is 1/3 Christian, 1/3 Sunni, 1/3 Shia. Okay, it's really, and within the Christians you have different groups, and within, there's 18 officially recognized sects. In Syria, I feel like Syrians are always saying, we are a mosaic just like Lebanon, and the same thing will happen to us. Look at Lebanon. There was a civil war in Lebanon. That could happen to us if we lose our central authority. But if you really, I don't believe in playing the sectarian game about saying, well, let's look at the percentages and these percentages mean that there's a high chance of civil war. But if we're going to play that game, then we should at least recognize that actually Syria has 75% Sunni, and the rest of that is, what are the Christians are? I mean, the Alawis and the Shia combined are like 13%. And then that leaves, another 10% basically that are the remaining minorities. So you don't have this incredibly fractious ethnic sectarian society. If we're going to go on the basis of that argument.
Okay, well, you didn't let me finish. That's why. That's why.
Okay,
that's why you didn't like my argument. Okay, I started with the sectarian one because that's what everybody talks about, and I was trying to say Syria is not Egypt and it's not Lebanon. It's somewhere in between the two. We also Egypt. You have Christians 10% and 90% Sunni Muslims. In Syria, we have 70 to 75% Sunnis. We have Alawites. We have Christians of many types. We have Druze. We have Ismailis. We have Yazidis, I think, also. These are the sects. Now, in Syria, we have also different ethnic backgrounds. In Egypt, you have all Arabs, 100% Arabs. In Syria, we have Arabs, we have Armenians, we have Kurds, Turkmens. And out of those groups, the other problem is that Kurds, the new Kurds in the northeast, these are the Kurds who these were refugees from Turkey, who came to Syria in the 50s, 60s, and 70s mostly. They escaped the Turkish army, if you want. Now they are in northeastern Syria, and they have feelings they would like to have, or not all of them, but a number of them, they would like independence for a Kurdistan. It's a dream, but if they feel that Syria becomes a weak country, if we get caught into some sort of civil war, I can see them saying, okay, fine, there's no more Syria. I want to split that part and make it Kurdistan. And most Syrian people will be scared from that possibility. I mean, I'm sure most of the Syrian people, including the older Kurds in Damascus or in Aleppo, they do not want to split Syria to split the Kurdistan in northeastern Syria out. So that's I've spoken to many Syrians, and that's something that we are genuinely fearing. In case we get into chaos, the Kurds could split, and they can declare their Kurdistan. And Turkey, by the way, is scared from that possibility, because if this happens in Syria, the Kurds in Turkey, who already started to demonstrate again, 12 Kurds were killed last week, supposedly coming from Iraq. One was killed before.
So you're saying it's ethnic, not just sectarian. There's an ethnic dimension there that needs to be.
There's an ethnic dimension. There's the religious dimension, and you can split Syria in many other ways. You have secular Syria and religious Syria. Among Sunni Muslims, I hate it when people expect Sunni Muslims to act as one bloc. Sunni Muslims, there are the risk-averse ones and the ones who are willing to take more risk. There are the secular ones and the religious and the ultra-religious. They don't behave the same way. I have many friends who are Sunnis who do not want regime change. They are either because they are risk-averse or because they know that there's a chance that the ultra-religious elements in a revolution in the Middle East end up on top at the end. We've seen it in the Iranian Revolution, which was the coalition that toppled the Shah of Iran, the very powerful Shah of Iran, was those on the left, the communists, the intellectuals, and the religious ones. And it looked that, like at the beginning, it looked like the communists and the secular ones will be governing. But as we know, the religious ones are the ones who took power. They put the communist ones in the prison. They killed them. They kicked them out of the country. In Egypt, we're seeing it already happening. The Salafists, who are estimated, I've read a BBC article where they have estimated them at 10% of the Egyptian people. That's equal to the number of Christians. That's about 8 million people. If you have 8 million Salafists in Egypt, that's a scary prospect. Already they are attacking every time they see a church. Something happening, reopening a church a few days ago. They went there and forced everybody out until the police took them out, and they shouted, Allahu Akbar, we won, we won.
You say that this is a possibility. Syria, it's even more likely that this could be a scenario.
I'm saying it's one of the possible scenarios. Again, most Sunni Muslims are not Salafists. They are far from being the type I'm describing. That's why I'm saying many Sunni Muslims are risk-averse. They are not ready to go that road because they can see that that Wahhabi or Salafi flavor infiltrating Syria. Thanks to Saudi Arabia, they've been pumping billions of dollars for the past few decades in every Middle Eastern country, trying to create such groups. The Salafis in Egypt are now brainwashed by, I think, 11 TV stations, probably financed by Saudi Arabia. So young Syrians are also affected by that kind of mentality, and they are a small minority, but they are a dangerous minority. And these are the people who get very passionate and active.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me, given everything you've said, because we're running out of time, what I really want to ask you is, given everything you've said, given the complexity of Syria, and the potential for things to spin out of control, is the argument you're making, if there isn't a strong central authority, given the ethnic divisions, sectarian divisions, the conflict with Israel, all these various factors that make Syria a potential powder keg, because you're saying that exists on one hand, but on the other hand, you're saying that the regime, you still need this regime, as long as but you're very much in favor of actually pressuring the regime to reform. How does the regime, what do you think are let's say, the 5 most important things that Bashar needs to do within the next year, if he is to survive this? Because in the long term, he's not going to survive it, right? I think we're agreed that if this continues and there's no move on the regime's part to make serious changes, if this kind of continues for another year or two, that it's not, eventually it's going to topple the regime. But if
civil war, it will not topple the regime. We'll get into civil war. If it continues for 2 years,
civil war,
civil strife, civil war.
Presumably, the regime wants to avoid civil war. So, what do you think are the top 5 or 10 things that they have to do, and how can they manage this complexity then?
They absolutely have to. And from everything I've been hearing, they are already working on them, and they don't need any encouragement. They don't need protesters to put pressure on them. They don't need President Obama to put pressure on them. They need just few more weeks. I know they're going very slowly, not very slowly, but they're going slowly. This is the mentality in Damascus. Whenever anyone inside or outside tries to put pressure on them, they refuse. They will totally not listen, and they will go at their own pace. They've decided already. And the French and American ambassadors, by the way, they've been having discussions with the Syrians, and they know that the regime has already decided to come up with a press freedom law, with a new political parties law, and
where they would allow. When you say by press freedom law, just so we're clear, basically where they're going to allow any newspaper published around the Middle East to operate in Syria, even if it's critical of the regime.
Well,
they're going that far?
Well, I'll tell you already what we know. Syrian TV today is covering all the demonstrations. A friend of mine just called me to tell me that one of the demonstrations that he was watching on Syrian television was chanting death, not death too, but down with the butcher, Bashar. Do you want more than that on Syrian television? They've already hosted a number of opposition figures, and I hear that many more will be given the chance to have 1 or 2 hour programs. They've had town hall meetings with students. Half of them were critical, half were pro-regime. And so we've already, more than that, showing somebody saying, down with Bashar the butcher, that's already a good sign that they're already agreed to open up the press. So they have.
What about the political parties law?
Political parties law, there's some disagreement there. I am totally on the side of the regime here. The regime will allow political parties, new political parties, and existing political parties to have a bigger role in leading the Syria, in competing for parliament, etc. The point of disagreement is that some in the opposition and some outside, including Prime Minister Erdogan, Saudi Arabia probably, would like Syria to allow religious parties to be part of politics. And the Syrian regime is extremely secular. They will insist on not allowing the Muslim Brotherhood or any Salafist party or anything to take part of politics. We've had very bad experience in the past with when you mix religion with politics, and you've had that in Lebanon, and we've had that in Iraq.
But okay, hold on.
That's not going to be offered. Go ahead, yeah.
Right. But isn't it, I mean, I have to ask, isn't it a little bit ironic that Syria is afraid about admitting parties that mix religion and politics, but their most important allies in Lebanon are parties that mix religion and politics, and that the party that is trying to form a government, that is leading the process of trying to form a government in Lebanon right now is Hezbollah, that mixes religion and politics. I mean, to what extent are they really afraid? I mean, they look at Hezbollah, right? Hezbollah is not going around telling their Christian allies that they should be veiling their women, and they're not getting involved in, they're not changing the social cohesiveness of Lebanon. To what extent do you think it's really, why would that be a problem in Syria?
Okay, well, first of all, Hezbollah, Syria did not create Hezbollah. It's a force in Lebanon. It represents the Shiite community and others outside the Shiite community.
No, I'm not saying that they created them, but they support them and they're on very good terms with them.
Okay, Syria is willing to support and to take as an ally anybody in Lebanon who represents a large number of Lebanese people. Support them is, what do they do in supporting, General Aoun, the Christian, for example, or Sleiman Frangi, another Christian. These are real parties who are close to Syria, and it's not only Hezbollah. Syria supports all the Lebanese who are willing to understand the red lines of Lebanon and not to act in a dangerous way. Hezbollah is very prudent, despite what many people think.
That's my point. My point is that given Syria, this regime's experience in working with a party like Hezbollah, for example,
and Hamas also, if you want, in the Palestinian side.
You can imagine a parallel party like Hezbollah in Syria, right? That is a religious party whose leader is a religious authority, that provides social services, that wants to get involved in politics in Syria. Now, why can that phenomenon exist without any problem in Lebanon with Syrian support, but not in Syria? I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood, provided they're not calling for the toppling of the regime or something that they can easily be accused of being treasonous or traitorous or whatever, why is that a problem for the regime for there to be religious parties if they have popular support?
Do you have religious parties in the U.S.? Do you have the Muslim or the Christian or the Jewish party in the U.S.? Ideally, you'd rather not have religious parties. Europe does not allow the Vatican to dictate anything on anybody. The same thing we would like to have in Syria. If we are building a new nation, if we are reforming, let's reform towards something that is proven to be easier to manage. So ideally, we would try to go in the right direction. In Lebanon, you already have a Hezbollah that is very popular for different reasons. In Lebanon, the Sunnis have guaranteed the prime ministership of the country. The Maronite Christians are guaranteed the president's position. And the Shia, who are now maybe larger in number than the Sunnis or the Christians, they cannot have any of these top two posts. So they were allowed to have weapons, to have military force. So it's sort of an informal arrangement for now until you in Lebanon decide to take the next step towards real democracy. And by the way, before we ask Syria, why don't we move overnight towards real democracy? Why don't you ask the Lebanese? Why don't you start your own revolution? Why? Because you are risk averse also. You know it's scary to shake the system which is for now stable and we're not killing each other. So it's not the right thing. Having Hezbollah or Hamas is not ideal. You know that many people are very uncomfortable because Hezbollah is mainly Shia party, and many people in Palestine and outside are not comfortable with Hamas because it's extreme, even though it has been moderated heavily by being in Syria. If you compare Khalid Mash'al's position now to his position when he used to live in Jordan, He lived in Jordan, by the way, for 10 years, and nobody accused Jordan of harboring terrorists. Only when he came to Syria, people started to say Syria harbors terrorists. King Hussein was Israel's best friend, and he had Khalid Mashal for 10 years in Amman, Jordan. And at the time, Khalid Mashal was not a moderate. He was absolutely not accepting Israel's existence. Khalid Mashal, after 10 years in Syria, he spoke, I think, to the Wall Street Journal or to Charlie Rose, and he made it clear if Israel would accept the 67 borders, he would accept Israel before 67 borders. So when Syria keeps part of Hamas in Syria, Syria is doing a good thing because they are moderating Hamas. And the same thing with Hezbollah. If you compare Nasrallah's speeches in the 80s, I'm sure you've heard on YouTube some of his earlier speeches where he was really a revolutionary Shia young man. As he became Syria's friend, he became much more moderate and much more pragmatic. Syria cannot undo Hezbollah or Hamas because these are forces on the ground, very popular forces on the ground. But Syria managed to moderate them. And
but this is my point: is that Camille, if there are popular forces on the ground in Lebanon that are operating that are religious parties. Since when have Middle Eastern governments, or any governments for that matter, managed to stifle religious parties in the Middle East by preventing them from coming to the fore? I mean, this is something that if they pass a political parties law in Syria, but they don't allow religious parties, I mean, don't you think that's just going to blow up in their face?
No, because, I mean, you could have conservative parties. You can have a party you can have a conservative party which has some people who are religious in it, and they can advocate good values and conservative society if they want to. But it's a party that has to allow non-Sunni Muslims to be part of it. It's not only a religious party which will not be allowed. Parties based on ethnic divisions will not be allowed. So you cannot have a Kurdish party because that party might advocate separating Kurdistan from Syria. And you cannot have an Armenian party, of course, or a Syrian party. You know, there are some Assyrian Christians who want a Syrian kingdom also. So you cannot have these kind of parties. Anything that will separate Syria, will divide Syria, is not a good thing. I don't think it's easy to, that's my opinion, and the regime, that's what I like in the regime. It's too dangerous to start reform along those lines. Look at Turkey. After decades and decades of being secular all the way, you have the army that was enforcing secularism. And actually, the army in the 90s, they removed the prime minister, a democratically elected prime minister, because he was too religious for their taste. So we have to experiment first with the easier formula. Let's keep the religious, ethnic, and regional divisions out of the way. By the way, in the 50s in Syria, we had parties which were mainly based in Aleppo. There were parties which were mainly based in Damascus. Damascene businessmen would be the main power in those parties. That was ridiculous also. And also, by the way, in the 50s, we had protests every day. It was never ending. Right. We had democracy, we had tons of parties and endless protests, and we had coup d'etats every year. So we cannot go all the way. That we have to learn from previous experiences also. It's much easier not to bring religion into the picture.
Yeah. Okay. So political parties law, press law, anything else that you think has to be done?
Fighting corruption much more seriously. I'm a regime supporter, but I could never tolerate what the regime is tolerating in corruption, because Syria's stability was based on allowing many powerful people to make money so that they're happy and they will not create problems for the regime. That includes maybe some people in the army, some relatives of the president, and lots of Damascene and Aleppo businessmen, Sunnis and you name it, and Christians. So that old way of maintaining stability has to go, definitely. I think if there's one thing that unites all the Syrian people, is that corruption is sickening. Syria is one of the worst countries when it comes to corruption. So definitely we'll have to see something meaningful. And I'm optimistic on that front. Of course, we cannot get rid of corruption because the United States has corruption and everybody has corruption except Switzerland. Maybe we will still have corruption, but we definitely would like to see very serious.
Lebanon does not have corruption, by the way. Lebanon has no corruption. You guys could learn a lot.
We can learn a lot from Lebanon in everything. Yes. Actually, look at Iraq. Iraq is supposedly a democracy. That experiment cost the United States up to $3 trillion, according to some experiments. What do we have now?
Yeah.
We still have the religious differences. We have the problem. We have more corruption. Iraq places much worse than Syria on corruption indices. I think the Economist or United Nations indices for corruption. So democracy by itself will not solve that problem. We have to stop blaming everything on the Syrian government or the Syrian regime because the Syrian people are corrupt also, most of them, many of them.
You're making so many friends in this.
I'm sorry.
You're making a lot of friends in this discussion.
Well, I hate how everybody is following the same narrative. So you cannot criticize the opposition, you cannot criticize protesters, you cannot criticize the people. Okay, so there are many mistakes that people make. I mean, the people will bring the next corrupt leader if we have democracy. So we have to criticize the people, we have to criticize opposition leaders. And it's really weird that nobody wants to criticize them because it's not popular to do so. It's so easy to just go criticize a dictator, but that's not enough. Anyways.
Okay, I think we've run out of time. Anything else that you have to say?
I would like to go back to President Obama's speech. It will take much more. I like President Obama again. His style is a relief from what we had before, from the Bush administration style. He's very prudent. He's very calm. There's no ego, but still, it takes a revolution in U.S. approach to the Middle East. We're not seeing that. We're not even seeing an evolutionary progress in the U.S. position. It's just the same thing with much more polite tone and much more pleasant tone. The president is still making the same mistakes. He insulted the Egyptian people by offering them $1 billion here and $1 billion from the Gulf states. People now, as the president said, people now are on Twitter and on Facebook and they have their cell phones and they have satellite TV. So they've already heard that Qatar is spending $100 billion on building soccer stadiums to show off that they are hosting the World Cup and now they're a very important country. It's the whole region that feels, it's the Arab world. I know these are two separate countries, but they still feel we are part of the Arab world. So if that tiny nation of Qatar is so selfish that it wants to spend $100 billion in building 5 or 6 stadiums that will be used for a few days for the World Cup 10 years from now, 12 years from now, and they're going to help Egypt with $1 billion, that's it. You have 80 million Egyptians who are hungry, who have just sacrificed half of their country's national reserve through that democratic revolution. And the rich Arab Gulf states, which are allies of the United States, and they listen to the United States, and they buy tens of billions of dollars of weapons from the United States. Yet the United States will not ask them to give Egypt more than $1 or $2 billion. And the U.S. administration that has spent that will spend by the time the Iraq war is finished, up to $3 trillion, $3,000 billion on that failed Iraq democracy experiment. It's failed, by the way, until now. And on Egypt, we're giving them.
Should have come out and said we're giving Egypt $100 billion or something like that.
Yeah, and if the United States doesn't want to spend the $100 billion on building Egypt and Syria and Jordan and Lebanon, why did the United States spend up to $3 trillion on Iraq? Let's say that's exaggerated. It's an estimate I read somewhere in the Washington Post. One economist came up with it. Yeah. Let's assume it's $1 trillion. Why is it so easy to spend $1 trillion on war, on destroying a country, and not spending $100 billion on Egypt and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan? You know how far that will go in getting the United States. You've seen opinion polls. The popularity of the United States in Egypt is like 18%. That's extremely low. You think that's not something that we should worry about if we are in Washington D.C.? Still, the Americans are
so
ignoring.
You think that they should be,
this is reality.
They should be embarking on like a Marshall Plan for the Middle East.
Yeah. Start by realizing that your popularity is in single digits in most of the Arab countries. And that's something to worry about. President Obama was again saying the nice things, and that we are with the people, and the people love us, and they love democracy. No, that's not the case. The people are very upset at the United States, and they're very upset at the rich Arabs. Remember, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1991, and I remember at the time, I'm in Montreal, Canada. I remember at the time I had rich Christian Syrian friends who have been Canadian for 10 years. They started to love Saddam Hussein because they hated the rich Kuwaitis who were so selfish, spending tons of money on themselves, on their palaces, and the Arab world is poor and dying from hunger in many places, in Sudan, in Yemen, and everywhere, in many places. So we have to be careful. We've seen already a wave of revolutions against dictatorships, against corruption, but we should be a bit more proactive and realistic and honest in realizing what the next wave of revolution could be like. It could be a revolution against the rich Arabs from the poor. We all know that food prices are going through the roof everywhere across the planet. So what happens when Egypt is very hungry? What happens when Palestinians are hungry? You have Palestinians in every rich Arab Gulf state. The United States has to use its leadership in telling Qatar to, instead of spending $100 billion on 5 soccer stadiums, to spend it in the region. And the United States has to do much more into starting. With Syria specifically, the United States, the only thing it knows how to do is use sticks. I haven't seen a carrot yet in decades.
Okay.
This is totally wrong approach.
Let's wrap it up here.
Okay. You're bored? Okay, fine.
I'm bored.
Okay.
Yeah, we're talking carrot. We've had this conversation.
Nobody's listening anymore. They all switched off.
Okay, so anyway, for Camille Otrakji and myself, Elias Muhanna, Nabki.com, thank you for listening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.